Hello.
Hello. You got it.
Is
Finally.
this Natty Marie?
Natty Nizzle. No, just
Okay.
kidding. Natty.
Awesome, awesome. So that's how you say it, Natty Marie?
hmm
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being a part of the show. Thank you for joining Who Dares Wins. Um, I'm really excited to have you on today. And I know that like we were trying to get this episode going for some time, and then there was some challenges, right? Like to try and like to do this, right? I really appreciate you coming on because that's what this is all about. It's all about facing our fears, stepping into what God has for us, and then also providing a platform for people who don't know God, who don't believe in God,
Yeah.
but to be encouraged and stepping out on taking risks, whether it be a podcast, telling your story, stepping into a new business opportunity or idea. I believe that God wants us to do so much more than what we're already doing, but not from a place of like my identity is in what I do, but from a place of rest that I get to do what I like to do, like that I get to serve God, that I get to serve people. And I'm excited to have you on the show today. I'm excited to have a show, especially during this pandemic. And for those who don't know that are listening on the audio, um, Natty is, you know, she's a beautiful person, and she's rocking some like festive colors right now. She got the blue beats on, and tell them a little bit about yourself. I just want to say before we go forward, I'm wearing the OG vintage extra large Marines U.S. Marines crew neck shirt for my grandfather. Happy Veterans Day to everybody who's listening. If you hear this after Veterans Day, no worries. We got you here at Who Dares Wins. So thanks for your service. All right, Natty, we're going to transition now. Um, Tell me a little bit more about yourself and what's your background? Where are you from? Um, and take it from there.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And it's just really beautiful how you articulated that earlier, just about like identity and, just taking risks. And that's kind of what we're called to do. So I'm really happy to be on this podcast. Thank you again for just the honor and privilege. Um, I really like the title, "Who Dares Wins." It's very much up my alley. As you know, I have some passion projects I'm working on too. So one of them, just the name is similar. Dauntless is dangerous. So Dude Afraid is just very much like they
Wow.
complement each other so much. But yeah,
Yeah.
well, first to answer your question in my little festivities here, this is a holiday pajama set. It's little reindeers, and I also my beads are actually like they're called midnight gray with like
Oh,
gold, so it looks blue because of the lighting. But yeah, just to answer your question, I wanted to.
I'm I'm colorblind like the post-Obama election.
Well, oh my gosh, that's too soon. I think that might be too soon. But I love your shirt. Actually, it's one of my favorite colors, red and dark blue. So yes, thank you to our Marines that have served this country. Truly, truly, we are home of the free because of the brave. So now I'm getting into
Nice.
it.
Yeah.
And to your grandfather who served this country, as well as my godfather and my cousin. They also served this country. So shout out to them, Uncle Frank and Frank Knuckle. So a little
Awesome.
bit about me. I guess like what do you want to know? Okay, so I guess I'll start from where I was born. Okay. So my name is Natty. That's actually my nickname. That's not my full name. I choose to go by Natty just because it's a cool little nickname. It was just something that became catchy as I started to get older. So I was born and raised in Miami. If you can't tell by my accent, I have a Latin. if you will, Latin twang, I guess. There's a Southern twang, there's a Latin twang, very picante, very spicy. I see you doing the. You're so silly. Um, so yeah, I was born in Miami. Um, from My mother is Latin, so she's actually from the beautiful island of Dominican Republic,
Nice.
and she was born there and raised in New York, as well as the beautiful Garden State, Jersey. And then
Hmm.
my father is Italian and Jewish, as you know, which we
Come on.
clarified it's a race. Not, it's important for people to know that. So, yeah. And so I was first generation, if you will, in Miami. I'm the eldest of five brothers, three that I grew up with, two that I didn't necessarily have the honor to grow up with, but got to, reconnect with them later on in life. And yeah, so I was just born in beautiful South Florida in North Miami Beach, Sunny Isles area for my Floridians who know where that is. And yeah, I don't know. What else do you want? I
Cool. Cool.
can tell you so much, so I want to make sure that I'm giving you the space to navigate me to the next question.
Sure. Sure. No, no, that's great. That's great. Thanks. So, did you grow up like with your mom and dad, or like what was that like?
So, I actually did not grow up with my mom and dad. My dad was, I guess, kind of present the first year. My mom and dad met when they did, and they didn't actually marry. So, I'm technically a child out of wedlock, however way that makes sense to people. But yeah, so I was the firstborn, and my mother had a second child, which is my brother. So it was pretty much just me and my brother, and my mom growing up a little bit after a year that my dad was in my life when I would guess what I was born. But then after that, he wasn't really present. So those couple years, those are, the pivotal, crucial years. I was just me, my mom, and my brother. It was kind of our life that we were growing up until about like five, 4.5, five, I would say. And then my mother met my stepfather, who pretty much I give the honor as one of my fathers.
Mm-hmm.
And he came into our lives around that time, and they started dating, got married, and yeah, so pretty much that was kind of like the second, I guess, segment, if you will, of my life where it started that I had just this season where it was just me, my mom, and my brother. And then around the age five, my parents, my stepdad and my mom met, as I mentioned, and they relocated to this small suburban town called Miami Springs. And so that's kind of really where my story began. The first couple of years was just kind of living in this like this little bubble, if you will, of like a wonderland. And then
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of like where I really remember my life kind of taking off, and ended up having siblings, two
Mm.
sisters,
Wow.
older, tons of cousins, and then a grandpa and a grandma, which I didn't really have. My grandmother lived up north in Jersey, so I didn't really have, that side of the family in my life. So it was kind of cool in a way. I was like adopted. I kind of got like these adopted family members. So my grandparents were actually Spanish. They're Cuban. My stepdad's Cuban. So it was a whole different culture because my mom raised my brother and I very American. She really took on the American values. So when we got introduced to this side of the family, it was, I want to say it was kind of like a culture shift for us. I remember it very well because I had to actually learn Spanish from my Spanish grandmother. And there was definitely like lost in translation, if you will, time periods where they would tell us to do certain things and we wouldn't be able to understand them, and they couldn't understand us, but we made it work. And we were just like little kids, like 5 and 6, that were just like, what is this? Like a whole new family, and then a whole new life, and then we have to learn a whole new language. It was so crazy. But
Wow.
yeah, so that's
Yeah.
my abuela and my abuelo.
Nice, nice. And so during this whole process, were you able to stay in touch with your biological father, or I know sometimes that
Yeah,
doesn't happen.
yeah, honestly, I do know my mom, and I do recall even for myself, he did try to, kind of keep in touch, and he did try to, find ways to communicate to us. But, for those people who come from blended families, or who have been remarried, especially if there's kind of like tension and friction from the prior marriage, it makes it a lot difficult to kind of have that into the new marriage or the new life. And essentially, I just think that was not a healthy timeline for my mom to just kind of allow my dad to physically be in our life. Just
Gotcha.
because he had his own traumas, but nonetheless, he was our father, so he was kind of like in and out, however way that worked itself out into our lives.
Awesome, awesome. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, that totally makes sense. It's always different for different people, like when it comes to like divorce or separation, you know? Like my parents got divorced when I was like one, but I didn't really realize that I mean, I felt the missing of my dad, but when I was in high school and I was living with him, that's when I really started to sort of have my parents are split and I'm trying to figure this out and everything. And I would bring it to him, no disrespect to you, Dad, but like I'd bring it to him and he'd be like, "What are you talking about? Like, we divorced when you were like one. Like, what do you mean you have
Wow,
issues?" And I was like, "Well, it's just like it doesn't matter when you break up, it still affects the child because
absolutely.
you're looking for identity, you're looking for purpose, you're looking for meaning, you're looking for validation, you're looking for
Yeah,
these things that you're supposed to get, and then your step parents, they don't necessarily know how to be your parents because they don't feel like they have the authority to step in and be your parent. You know what I mean? And like when my stepdad, it was like much later in life where he was like, all right, I'm gonna take some charge, you know, and until my dad could, But anyway, now I'm older and I'm finding my way by myself. Just kidding, just kidding. I love you guys. Um, so I think that's a great way for us to shift. We're gonna shift now into. So I understand that you're a Christian and you have an interesting walk with Jesus. I'd love to hear you talk about, um, just letting people know if you're listening, and you obviously are because you're listening. But I just wanted to say that like me and Natty have known each other for about a little more than a year. So we've done a lot of life together. And so I know some of Natty's story, but this is just an opportunity that I felt to give her that opportunity because I feel like it can be a real blessing to you, the listener, and to us, the people doing it, and to Nettie herself. There's a power when we release our testimony. It says that we overcome the devil by the word of our testimony and the blood of the Lamb. Not to preach too much, but the blood of the Lamb is Jesus, and the testimony is how we overcome through the power of Jesus, like in our lives. Um, I'd love to hear you talk about Jesus, um, sort of like when you were with the artisans as well, like the sort of like you know anarcho stuff that you were with in a way, and then also like how Jesus brought you back. Like I know I might be skipping some things, but I just think that like that was really really interesting how like you got saved and then you went through another period and then you came back to the Lord, but you also were part of these other movements that I think kind of showed you about what Jesus should be like, but you weren't really seeing in church, if I got that correct. And but this is your time. But that's what I was thinking. We could go now.
cool. Thank you so much. Yeah. Um, so something I actually wanted to mention, to actually just touch on that you mentioned earlier was about identity, and that's just something that is very key, especially in the makeup and the development of a child. So this is where kind of like you can see how everything starts from the foundation. It's if the foundational thing is our identity. So yeah, parents being in our lives, and also what they carry as far as their identity as well is so key. So in that regard, because it kind of ties into my testimony on identity and just kind of how that was just such a easy area for just me to be, I guess, like I want to make sure I'm using words that are um, just understandable. I don't want to use some of the Christianese words, how we could be in the kingdom.
Totally.
We can be above, like literally soaring up so high. And then we're like, yeah, we haven't gotten to this place of humility to remember that people haven't arrived to some of those terms. So, yeah, I just want to make it very easy. But I was 5 years old when I actually first encountered Jesus. I know this is crazy, but
Wow.
I
Okay.
vividly remember this. It was actually right when my parents I say my parents, so I'm going to try to be clear. My stepdad, which I call Papi. So my father actually called dad, or like my father, but Papi is usually when I'm referencing my stepdad. And so when my parents got together, we moved into my abuela's house, like I mentioned. And I remember this day like vivid. It was Saturday morning, and back in the day, Saturday morning was key for kids. We'd wake up at like the crack of dawn, and this was specifically between the hours of 7 and 8. And I remember it being around Christmas, like around the holiday. Because I remember Big Bird from Sesame Street was on the TV, and I was by myself in like the back area, which we call the sala, which is like the living room area or the back room. And he was ice skating, and I was by myself, which a lot of those years, younger years for me, I found myself always by myself. I can kind of vividly remember those. um, so I was in the back, and I just felt like this presence like next to me on the couch. And somebody else would think this is where a child is like borderline, hallucinating, seeing things. But it was so crazy because it was like this impression, if you will, which I can't articulate that at that age, but I knew as I got older, like what I experienced was like an impression from, this realm to another realm. And somehow like just all these colors started to kind of like just come to light. And I remember just feeling so much joy. And I was laughing like so much because whatever this impression was, I could feel it and I could see it. And it was trying, the face was like, it was like Jesus. It was just trying to kind of like, it was very blurry, but as it was trying to kind of focus itself in, I could see it like a hologram almost. And I was just laughing so much because it took the time to meet me where I was in that moment by myself, alone a lot as a kid, and just joy. And most people who knew me, as my family, when I say most people who know me, like my family, those years, I was such a happy baby. I was always laughing. I was filled with so much joy. A lot of the pictures my mom took of me where it's just always so joy filled. People would come to her and be like, "Oh, she's such a happy baby. Oh my goodness." Some of them would actually even give her money to give to me. So that was I think the time that
Wow.
people were already starting to tithe into my ministry. I had no idea that that was a word back then, but I think that's where God was like, "We're gonna
Come
sow
on.
into this one." This
Come
future,
on.
benefits gonna cash this one out. So, but
Amen.
so
Amen.
it's important. It's really like we talked about identity and foundational things. This is so important because it plays a role into my later years as I'm walking, with Jesus and walking through hardships and just the attacks of forces of darkness, all the words you want to say that came at me. It really came after my joy. It really
Wow.
came after the design that God had, initially created in me. And that was where my identity got hit. And you kind of believe the lies when they're just coming at you so much. So, to answer your first question, I think you were talking about the how I grew up in the church.
Yeah, yeah. But before we do that, I think that was really interesting, like just the correlations of the hits, and like as those hits continue, we begin to think that that's truth
Yeah,
because it's happening so much. We begin to think that maybe that's God. Like like God's will for me is struggle. God's will for me is to suffer. Is
absolutely.
and and it's sad because, sometimes we don't have a voice in our life to tell us that's not actually God, that wasn't him. And so, I just really love that you brought that up. And
Thank
then
you.
also like how you complemented that with the identity piece. It's really important. So, just want
Yeah,
to
that's
say, yeah, yeah, go ahead.
no, yeah, thank you. It's actually it's thank you for saying that because that is very much what happened during those years. I had so many things that were happening from a very young age up until even now, in my adult years. And there was a very distorted reality. And I felt like I was disassociated and disconnected to how he had essentially wanted me to know that was my design. So yeah, there was a lot of distortion because of this suffering, and then disassociated for some time. But yeah, so I grew up in the church from that age, from 5, and my mom pretty much was like the one that kind of geared that on for all of us. We started in a church. It was a Baptist church called Miami Springs Baptist Church, actually in my town, and I went through pretty much all the way up until I would say my youth. Most of my family all went cousins. It was very much a Sunday thing that we all did. And then afterwards, we'd have like, the family style brunch every Sunday at my grandmother's. And then after that, my mom also had enrolled us into private school. So I was also in private school, Baptist as well. It was called First Baptist in the next city over from Miami Springs, for those who know the next city over the bridge. And yeah, so that was pretty much my upbringing. Was I grew up in a Christian home. I knew the morals, the values, the scruples, and we just that's just how our family operated. As I got to middle school, I did start to experience a lot of awareness in what was happening in church. And I think that's kind of where the second wave of distortion started to hit me, because I just saw these inconsistencies with a lot of the kids. And I started to notice that a lot of those kids that kind of just projected certain judgments or certain attitudes were a lot of the times like the pastor's kids or the ministry leaders' kids, I'm sorry. So, yeah, like that was something that I noticed. And then as I got a little bit more aware in those years, I noticed there was kind of like an emptiness and a hollowness in the big church, as we would call it as little kids. And I just started to feel like the spiritual side, I guess, or the spirituality of God was just kind of like disconnected and distant and kind of cold. The years I was growing up, there was fulfillment, and I found that in like the Sunday school with the songs and the teachers who really poured out, and a lot of the times being with my family, because we really were such a unified group, a family unit growing up. But of course, like
Wow.
everything the enemy does, he brings hits and lies and disruptions in the dynamics of the family. So yeah, that's kind of how it started in my this kind of like a little bit of my spiritual heritage. As I got to high school, this is kind of pivotal for me. And then I know we're going a little over that time, so I'll wrap this up for the first segment. But I was about 15 years old, and I know that day was a pivotal time where my mom kind of approached all the kids, and she was kind of just housekeeping, as well as spiritual housekeeping. Like, everyone goes to church every Sunday, so that's like a non-negotiable. And this particular Sunday, everyone's getting baptized, and I remember in my spirit just like everything kind of just like a cat, if you would, were like, wait, what? And I was like, hold on, hold on, hold on. And in my mind, I knew that there was like this thing called free will, right? Free choice. And at least I'm an American, so I'm like, I want to honor, my free will and free choice. So she had us, I remember this day so specific because I had told her, I was like, Mom, I love you, but I honestly feel like this is a decision that I want to make personally, and I feel like this is being forced. And as I get, if I decide to do this, I want to do this on my own accord, in a setting that's so organic and natural and in nature. If I'm going to ever get baptized, I see myself getting baptized in the beach, like under the moon, stars, and in the sky, like in nature, blah, blah, blah. Just making my case as I would. My mom always said I should have been a lawyer. So I feel like that was one of those times where I was honestly starting to make my case. And essentially, it's like, I mean, if anyone can laugh at this, it's essentially what I did was I rebelled my own baptism. But she said that was one of the, defining moments for her too, because she was such an amazing mother. She was very protective. We were very sheltered, which could be good and bad. A lot of times parents don't realize they're doing it, but it's operating out of fear and sometimes controlling the circumstances and the outcomes. And so she did amazing with us, but that's where I feel like God really drew a line in the sand and was like, this right here, this is not, this is like, you can't touch this. This is a non-negotiable. And she said that like years later, we had this conversation. She's like, I remember that day because God actually spoke to me. I was like, really? God spoke to you? She's like, yeah, he told me, don't you dare push her because if you do, she will never come back. So you need to lay off on this. And I was like, oh my God, you never told me. She's like, of course I'm not going to tell you because I'm your mother. I still have to be like the disciplinary. It's so funny. So yeah, long story short, at 15,
Wow.
I technically kind of rebelled my baptism, but it was so amazing because God met me in his faithfulness as he would 10 years later. And I did indeed finally get baptized on my own accord, and it was organic. It was in nature, just how I wanted it. It was at the beach, which I love the water. I'm such a water baby, still am. And it was actually in front of this lighthouse, which I'm obsessed with lighthouses. So the whole thing, it was so, he's so into the details, right? And this area is actually called El Farito. People know in Miami, we call it Bill Bags Park. But yeah, that's kind of where my second story started with the Lord and my journey into that season. So we can.
Wow. That's amazing. Oh man. Thank you so much for sharing that. That's really cool. It's cool how God will meet us where we're at. I know when I got baptized, I was 15 the first time I got baptized, and I got baptized so that I could become a deacon, so that I can make
Wow.
some changes in our church. Because we didn't have a thriving youth ministry. We didn't have any outreach. We didn't have any of that. I'm 15 years old, and I was like,
Mm.
how can we do that? How can we make this church not dead? And my mom was like, you could become a deacon. And then when I became a deacon, they were like I literally got out of the water, and then I was like, go up to the deacons, and I'm like, how do I become a deacon? And
Wow.
they were like, you can't be a deacon, you're 15. So if you could continue, go ahead. Just wanted to like
Thank you.
kind of share that, narrate it in a way.
Yeah, no, that's so great. Thank you. Yeah, that's kind of, I mean, I was honestly like 23, 20, between 23, 24, however way you want to wager. It was actually September 19th, 2010. So I have a date. That's my spiritual birthday. And my father's birthday is actually September 18th, my real father. And then my aunt, his sister, Karen, her birthday's the 19th. So it was so God even in the details for me to be sandwiched in that. But it was a long time coming, and I feel like that was just finally the day that it was like, okay, like you have to just let everything go. Like everything you've been holding on to, like your own decision making, your own choice. I was very, I was free spirited, but also very strong willed in certain aspects. So it was honestly the day I really surrendered. So that was, I think, before I could count the cost, I think it was more about the surrender. Because then we will fast forward into 2013, and that's when I really counted the cost because I left everything behind in 2013. But
Okay.
between 2010 and 2013 was honestly just the first years, if you will, when you're kind of like a baby in the faith and you don't really have a full understanding, but you're just kind of really excited and you're just kind of doing the new thing. And
So,
so I was very involved in the church. Obviously, at the time, I was serving, like I said, as a stage director and designer. So production was always kind of like my niche. I studied production and fashion merchandising. So it was kind of my way of being like, God, I'm going to give you these talents. So I at least had this understanding that I wanted to give my talents to him. And that's kind of why I started in that area. Uh,
mhm.
but, like I said, this is where discipleship, and you and I both can attest, is so important, and also covering. So I didn't necessarily stay so rooted in my walk as, most Christians, I can't say most, but like there's a good majority who started and just did well. I was just in that first beginning phase, and of course, like the first little test comes, and sometimes you succeed and sometimes you don't. And so in this case, relationship came into my life, and that's honestly outside of identity is another real wound for me, as well as just an easy target that the enemy, kind of enticed me with. So I was in a relationship, and that kind of veered me off a bit. I did try to kind of introduce to him, where I stood as a believer So I was kind of trying to figure out the balance in doing both. But when you really understand the kingdom and you really understand what we're called to do, you know that that's not what you know, but there's grace, right? There's grace, and no one told me that.
Yeah.
So that's where he gave me that time to like learn the hard way. And honestly, I really did. It was very painful, because now I have a soul tie, and that's a conversation I'm sure you could talk about on another time of your podcast. But this
Sure, sure.
caused a lot of friction in my just my journey with God. And so I had to
Your
kind of
theology. Yeah.
not so much my theology. I think it was more just again going back to identity, and then just like feeling shame and feeling guilt that I had to like
Like a
uh
tug of war.
just no more like like a just like guilt and a shame that I just felt like, oh God, I have to come back now and like wash myself instead of coming under His grace, which is His doing. And so I always felt like I had to, if I made a mistake, I had to kind of you know uh, put
Yeah,
myself back
like we got to
together.
clean ourselves up and
Exactly. Thank
everything.
you. That's the word
Yeah.
I was looking for. Like clean myself up, and then I would be right with God. And I know that has a lot to do with like my upbringing and the dynamics of my family and the culture. So finally, this was a very pivotal time too, when I did give my life back to Christ, but like completely sold out, completely surrendered, counting the cost, like you said, and not looking back, which was honestly very painful time, because I literally had to like change my number, change my email, change my Facebook, just because I wanted to be so radical that this time I wasn't going to miss it. This time I was going to hit the mark, and I wanted to honor him in every way, shape, and form, because I knew I grew up in the faith. I knew what this was supposed to look like. And so I didn't want to dance, I guess, if you will, with the devil anymore. But
Yeah, you were all in. You were
I was
all in.
all
That's
in.
awesome. Cool.
So this was a time where it was also very painful for me, because I had lost my best friend lost her little sister, and so that was a time for me that I was coming out of this relationship that was honestly not the best, and we both had had our different issues and struggles, but it really was the catalyst to bringing me to that place of surrender and just really seeking God's face. And so when she passed away, it really just changed a lot in me. Essentially, a part of me died, and it took a long time for me to actually heal from that. To this day, it's about 8 years, and I'm finally being able to talk about it and just be okay with that the reality, which it really disturbed a lot of my last couple years, especially trying to walk with God, and then understanding Him as good, especially after it was like giving my life to Him. And I'm like, if you're good, how could you do this? So I
Yeah, it
actually
sounds like it
believe
was very tragic.
oh
Sounds like
yeah,
it's very tragic.
it really was. I mean, at the end of the day, I know my best friend suffered the most, was her, her blood sister, but they were like, my sisters. And so I never really shared much about this outside of my family, but I actually had such a vendetta towards God. Like I actually hated God for a season, and I was like, oh my
Yeah,
God, like
that's understandable for sure. Yep.
I was like, this is so psychotic. Like, how do you love God and then go to this place of hating Him? And I remember I was like, I had this actual conversation. If you would see me, you would have thought I was crazy, but I was like, I want nothing to do with you. I can't believe that you would do this. I know that you did this. This is your fault because you're in control and you're sovereign, and all the words that they use in the church, right? Which could backfire. In this moment, it backfired.
Absolutely. Yep.
So I just had to like really ride through that, and it was very dark period. It was a kind of like a violent tempest, if you will. And I remember the day that God literally brought me to my cousins, who were so pivotal in my spiritual walk and my foundation to this day. And they walked me through, some of the inner healing, as this was a journey and the discipleship. And I remember the day that my cousin said to me, Naty, God is not afraid of your anger. God is not afraid of your words. God is not afraid of even you having to say that you hate Him and you don't love Him and you don't want Him in your life. He can
Yeah.
handle that. And that was so defining for me, JP, because
Wow.
I was like,
That's good advice.
wow, God, honestly, I never got permission to ever process my emotions, especially me growing up, being the eldest. an only girl, like I mentioned, with, brothers, and also having a lot of responsibilities. So I had life experiences, and I kind of like stuff them down, and things would happen, and I would just be like, okay, that happened. And I never really got time to process. So when I did process, it was kind of like awkward and displaced, And so when she said that to me, I was like, what? Like I can actually like let it all out. Like I can actually just like be fully just like, and I remember the day I
Wow.
did, I just broke down, and I just felt his
Let him have
love
it.
just wash over me. And I couldn't
Mm,
believe, like, it was such a setup. It was such a setup. Like, you can deny me. You can still hate me. You can say all that you want, but I will still love you. I will still choose you. I will still be here because I can handle your pain. I can handle your anger and your hatred and, all this stuff.
yeah, the Bible says he's near to the brokenhearted. That's
Yeah,
awesome.
totally. I
That's so
totally
good.
saw that testament to that for sure.
So good. Wow. Yeah, so man, so dang. That's hard. I know that like, last year I lost a very close friend, but I think it's even more powerful when you're younger like that. It's form like I feel like God was still forming you, you know, and then it kind of brings you into this moment where you're just like, what? Or it's almost like Elijah.
Hmm.
And so so what happened after your cousins got involved in your life and they were encouraging you? Just wanted to let you know. So we're like at like 40 minutes or so, so we have about 20 minutes left, and doing great. And so um yeah, what happened with that? Like after that? So well, was it like, okay, like your cousin stepped in, they encouraged you, you yelled it out with the Lord, and then you were like on stage leading a mega church. What happened?
No. You had to take me there, huh? Well, to be honest with you, yeah, God really used them a lot. And uh man, I honestly, JP, I should be a statistic across the board, in all truth. If you fill in the blank, like you fill in the blank, I would fit there. So it's honestly his grace and his love and his mercy and kindness that I'm even to this day here.
Mm,
But there was so much grief and so much sadness and so much despair. And so that was about a 6 month journey that God had to really kind of go through the first couple of layers with me. And then essentially after that, in his humor, he would decide to bring me back to my hometown because I did a lot of my life outside of my town, even though I lived there. And I had moved out a couple times with my parents and lived on my own. So during this time, I had moved back home, and I remember this church that I was a part of was opening up a satellite church in my town. And I remember just being like, what? Like, who in God's creation knows about this town that is not even on the map? Like, you literally have to live there to know about it, or you like, run into the town by accident if you're driving past it, which I've told you before. It's like Sleepy Hollow meets Pleasantville hybrid. And so it turns out that there was someone who lives there that was going to launch the campus. And at first, I was actually getting the emails. I found this out during the pandemic as I was going through my storage. I found the letter, and it's interesting. I never opened this letter, but I got the letter signed from the campus pastor to invite me to that church. And I remember when I first got the email, I was like, who is this? And how did they get my email? I was already like on the defense. I am not going to this church. I am not helping this campus because it's in my town. And I'm running away from everything that has to do with my past, right? Because some of the painful things that I had already experienced from the death and the loss, and grief is real. So it starts bringing up other stuff that you're like, oh wow, like really, I didn't process this. It's like, yeah, and it just keeps coming. Grief is strange. But long story short, in a way, I was running, so God had to really like deal with me at that moment. And I remember the pastor I was under, the campus I was under with the pastor. He specifically said, so like to this day it was so vivid. He was like, church, I love you. We love you. And honestly, God loves you. But we know some of you have been serving here, or probably serving, full time, or serving like, on Sunday like it's full time. But he's like, honestly, if God is calling you to this location, uh, I love you, we love you, but please leave. Like you're holding a seat for somebody. And I was just like, what? Like in my heart of hearts, I just knew that was God, because for like 3, 4 months it was a wrestle. And when that came out of his mouth, I could just feel the words. Sometimes you could just feel the words, conviction that comes over you, and you're like, does anybody else see that or feel that? It's like, no, it was for you. So go, stop being disobedient. So I essentially was like, okay, like, but I'm like your stage director. I'm like your stage designer. Like you need me. This is like my argument again, trying to make a case. So I went, I surrendered, and I, lo and behold, was a part of the pre launch and launch of this campus in my hometown, which happened to also be in my middle school, which is so bizarre because, right, God's in the details. So long after I left the private school in First Baptist, I went to public school into my junior high years. So it was really cool because I danced there. I did gymnastics there. I was in drama there in the same auditorium that I'm planting the church. So I was just like, what? Like, I can remember myself in sixth grade sitting in these seats. So it's just, again, God in the details. And I'm just like laughing at the humor of, him putting this all together. So,
Yeah, it's real.
you know, it's real, yeah. So the first couple, months were great. We're planning this church. It's so healthy. Majority of them is young adults. The pastor's young. Um, and beautiful, of course, and so many people were coming to this church for their different reasons. And at one point, you know, just like everything in life, you have this momentum and you have this vision, and you're going and you're going. And I think, the enemy. In this case, you're going to have to explain to your audience, if this is a Christian podcast, but
The devil,
the enemy, the devil himself, is so
a
conniving
hater.
and all of the above. And so he's not threatened by a big church. He's
Good.
threatened by a united church. A
Whoa,
united church
come
is
on.
his biggest threat. And so I had to learn this, unfortunately, later on in my grief, which took about 5 years, up until, honestly, this year, I would say 2019, 2020. I finally was able to put that to rest and just bury it with the hatchet, as we all kind of died in this season. And then God was just kind of like, whatever dies this season cannot be resurrected. And so that was one of them. So this is a pretty big thing for me
Wow,
to even talk
powerful
about it.
word. Hmm.
Yeah. So yeah, so we were like a family. We were so healthy. It was a vibrant young adults church practically, and we had, some elders that were there that were older, but it was mainly just a younger pastor with, a lot of younger millennials. And like I said, the enemy's just always clever and conniving, and he also knows the ways to hit with his fiery darts. And so, there was a period in that time of the ministry that I was honestly all hands on deck, like I told you. Um, I counted the cost, and the cost for me was big. Leaving the community that I had created in the art scene in Wynwood, all of my friends, um, also like even not working at the time. I was working at this bar in Wynwood. It was one of the first bars, walking at like close to 800 to 1200 a night. I mean, that's a lot for
Wow,
someone
that's a
who's like
lot.
25, 26. And at this point, I was 27. When like we launched, I had just turned 27 on October 13th. So I had laid it down at 27, the year that we were going into 2014. So I counted the cost. And, so there were some things that started to happen, through the course of us, launching this church. And I did, honestly, I felt God had used me to just to fill the need and to use my gifts. And sometimes we may not see, we may not see the full lens and the full perspective of our own, of our own stuff. And if I can honestly, to this day, I even try to reach out to one of the pastors who was young. He was a younger pastor, kind of like one of the worship pastors. And I asked him, I was like, this was in 2019 before I had moved up to New York. I was like, I want to meet with you because to this day, I don't really know what actually happened in the dramatic exit, if you will, or like just like having me to like be sent away from the campus. And he said he was going to meet with me, and he's like, absolutely, I will definitely tell you. And it never happened, unfortunately. And I just kind of rested with the Lord, and we were actually going to meet, and I think it was more I was something happened. I was supposed to meet. Somebody else wanted to meet with me, so I kind of pushed back the time, and so we didn't get to actually meet. But if I can discern in my spirit what it was something in reference to. Um, Sometimes we can overshadow people without even meaning to, especially if the calling in our life is so big, especially if the gifts that we have, they can provoke jealousy, they could provoke envy, they could provoke all these things. And it's not saying nobody is significant and as well equipped or their calling's even bigger and greater. But essentially, that's, I feel like, where the enemy really caused some friction and some tension. And, it was a very young church, like I said, and at some point, and, whether it's up for discussion or dispute. People want to disagree. Whoever listens to this and is from that community, my whole point is not to bash or hurt or to slander. The truth is the truth, and the reality is that was a very young church, and a lot of people are walking through their sanctification process, and so it was all the very high school like behavior, the gossip, the slander behind the scenes, the sarcasm, the little passive aggressive jokes, this competition and rivalry, especially for the attention of the pastor at the time, which like I felt like every person who was a woman, a female that was coming to this campus, their whole premise was not Jesus. And that could be another conversation for my own individual, um, testament podcast or whatever. But it was
And
a challenge.
did you get
And
smitten too?
I want to say no comment on that. The Lord knows my heart. The Lord knows my heart. But essentially, no, I had a lot of love for him. I had a lot of respect for him and admiration. And I think that's really where my heart was broken in you know, the shift in when, some attacks started to come. And God put me in a position where I had to kind of just speak up on behalf of the people because, again, like I counted the cost and I'm like, no, like I'm not doing this, God. Like I didn't surrender and sell out the world for this. Like, honestly, they're worse. Like, are you kidding me? Like, no. And he really had to teach me love. He's like, I know this is painful, but this is where you're going to truly learn how to birth love. And I'm like, Lord, I love so well. Like, I love everybody. He's like, no, 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 but when you can love from this place of like suffering, it's really truly love.
Love your enemy.
Because it's not your love, it's the love that comes from Jesus. So it was very humbling, very humbling. But yeah, so going back to some of the warfare that we were experiencing was a lot of like discord and division. There was from the higher ups, and I know I'm gonna refrain from certain words, but I'm sorry, certain names, but from the higher ups at the main location, the motherboard, if you will, down south, there was just kind of some leadership that was overseeing all the campuses. We were a multi-campus of 9. So you talk about megachurch, we fall into that category. And it was honestly just such a spirit of control and domination and domineering and manipulation and verbal and emotional psychological abuse. I know this because I witnessed how it affected the pastor that I was literally his right hand doing life with
Wow.
practically for a year and a half. And then come to find out, because God brings everything to light, this actually was confirmed through other pastors who had to leave or later left on bad terms because this specific pastor tactic was, interrogation and, abuse of verbal and emotional. So,
Mm,
God was really good to bring that to light because, you know, um, I know he wasn't happy with a lot of the circumstances that started to manifest later on. And as if you ever planted a church, John Paul, I'm sure you have, JP. God has allowed me the opportunity to be a part of several church plants. I think at this point it's on the last when I finally close out my season. The last one was like the fifth, and it's very taxing. There's a lot of warfare, and a lot of the times you're just so spiritually, like emotionally, mentally weak. So I think this was around the time that we were coming to this place of just being fatigued spiritually, mentally, emotionally, serving, building, loading setting up, breaking down, and that's when he comes to bring the attacks. And so he really brought an attack towards me and this specific leader,
Mm.
this pastor, and who I again like loved, adored, had so much respect and admiration because I had never seen a male, healthy male figure in my life lead, let alone lead by example. And so,
Wow.
he and his own frailty, and the way that the enemy just tried to like manipulate certain circumstances that in part weren't really true. They were just circumstances that were taken out of context. I come to find out that there are certain people, like I mentioned, in the community of that church that were very envious and very jealous, and they ended up sharing information that I had just disclosed out of just hurt, by some actions that I kind of saw the leadership very distracted, especially the specific pastor, and kind of just falling almost into his flesh. And there was a girl that started going to the church at that time, and I just felt that we were not focused, and the attacks kept coming more and more as the distractions were coming. The more rundown we were, the more spiritual warfare was manifesting, especially from this head leadership at the main campus. So I actually had made a mention that I needed to step down for a season just because I just needed to refresh. I was very tired. There were terms that people were saying about me, that I was, um, what's the word that they use a lot in the church, that I was burnt out. It wasn't that I was burnt out. I was actually very brokenhearted. I was very, very hurt by the things that I was starting to see. And I started hearing people who were a part of the church actually come to me in confidentiality because they trusted me and they knew that if anyone could get to him, it would be me because we were very close. And they were just so hurt by a lot of the abuse that they experienced, whether it was them individually having conversations with the pastors, the marriages that they would bring to the pastors.
Wow.
Uh, our divorce rate actually ended up going up more than it should within those 3, 4 years. I ended up leaving after the second.
Wow.
And, I just kept saying to this individual who was one of the lead pastors, I was like, listen, like, people are not okay, people are not happy, people are coming like to me very upset, and I don't know what's going on. Like, I don't know if you're distracted, I don't know if there's just like a lot of pressure from the higher ups that are putting on you. But I know who you are, I know what you carry, I know that you're going to be great, you're going to probably, I know that you're going to even be greater than like the pastor who's the senior pastor. You're going to end up being him someday. And it's ironic because those words did manifest and he did in fact become the senior pastor. But there was so much pressure on him because he was trying to appease everybody, and I just started to see the spiritual anemia, if you will, that he was wanting to please man and not God. And again, that was his wrestle with identity, as mine had been wrestled with identity, so I could have a lot more compassion and empathy towards it.
Yeah.
um, but so coming to the close of that, we had a situation where I was honestly, people noticed that I had changed. My joy, the joy that God had restored, had gone away. I was very, I was very unhappy. I was very more than unhappy. I was just very hurt, and I was just trying to kind of like silence my grief
Mm.
and just keep my focus. This is the mission field. I need to stay mission focused, mission based. This is why I'm here. And essentially, I'm a human being, but I was kind of like operating like like a war, like a general, over my own emotions and feelings, and not being honestly, being fair to myself. So this one specific day, I remember leadership brought me into this meeting, if you will. I was working at the time, not working, I actually was offered several positions, and I just felt in my heart that I didn't want to work that season, at least for a whole
Yeah.
year, just to do my due diligence. But I remember I was um, I was kind of like an assistant to the multi-campus pastoral admin of 9 campuses. So I was like an apprentice to her during the summer. And I remember they came into the little computer area where all the pastors collect their mail, and asked one of the leaders from my actual campus, asked me if he could talk to me. That there some concerns about like, not so much my performance, but like what they had noticed in my demeanor, and they just wanted to have a conversation with me. Would I be open to it? So I was just kind of like, okay, God, like, what is this? I have no idea if this is even something. Is this even you, or is this like a setup? So I went into the bathroom. I remember I excused myself. I said I would be there. And I just had this like real moment with the Lord. And I was just kind of like done. I was done of like the tyranny that was going on. I was tired of like the premature, immature, all of this stuff. Even some of the leadership at the church were kind of like dancing around a lot of the issues with the young adults and just kind of making excuses for it. And I remember I looked at myself in the mirror and I said to the Lord, God, I want nothing to do with this meeting. But if you are calling me to this meeting to represent you, I will come to this meeting because I know that there are things that are happening in our campus that you're not happy with. There were some girls that were apparently saying that they were kind of being like womanized by certain people in leadership, or, we had men's group and women's group. So we had like appointed some women and some men. And so there were just some girls that were mentioning this. And I was just like, oh my gosh, like, I just kept feeling like I was like doing housekeeping and babysitting and trying to like, and I realized at the end, like codependency, there's twofold. Those are the people who are codependent, and then there's the people who want to like save and protect and like enable. I was kind of falling into that. This, came to me later on during one counseling session that I entertained at that campus just to, close that out. But so I had this face to face moment with the Lord. I was like, I crucify my flesh. I'm just literally giving this to you. I want nothing to do with myself. And I went into that meeting. And let me tell you, that was probably by far the worst like lie of hell for anyone to say that they were just having a meeting, because it was entirely set up for interrogation, and they humiliated me. They brought these things, to the light. They were asking me these questions that were kind of very intimate and personal, and brought up things from like people that had heard what it was only honestly one person that I honestly had entrusted, who I come to realize had such envy and jealousy, and was one of the same girls that was probably also interested into like the leadership. So again, all this like dynamics that really just had nothing to do with God, and was already kind of like just giving me this distortion of like dysfunctional family dynamics when I had my own kind of family dynamics at home. And I just remembered having to face this senior pastor, and I'm looking at him and he's looking at me, and he almost was like, his interrogation was to kind of like make himself clear to me that I run this ship, and if you're trying to be a threat to this ship, I'm going to make sure that you know that like you're going to suffer. It was like just this, again, this is not assumption, but this is like the body language. Sometimes body language can say more than words, and it was so aggressive. And so I just remembered he asked me all these questions, and he was like, what is your motive? What are your motives that you feel that you have to share this information? And I said, in all truth, most of what I've shared with you, you had personally requested from me, and I'm going to be honest as well. Most of what I've mentioned to you is in the Bible. And I was starting to quote like First and Second Timothy about like not many of you should be teachers, and like keeping things in secrecy. And so I remember the look that day on his face. It was almost like, I'm going to make you pay, suffer malice kind of laugh, but angry. And I just remember turning my focus away from him. And I just looked at this person who was my friend, as well as the pastor over our campus. And I just was looking at him like with love, but with so much pain, because again, I was hurting for my own personal reason, but my reasons also was like I felt like I had been let down by someone that I absolutely looked up to and admired. But I had to really learn later on that he was obviously just a person and man. But I essentially was a baby Christian. I didn't
Yeah.
realize this until later on in the process. And so
Yeah. Yeah. You
he,
shouldn't have been
I
put in
just
that
said to him,
position at all. actually.
Oh, absolutely not. I was outnumbered. I
Not
was
not
like,
even like
uh,
outnumbered, but just like this is the big error that many churches make nowadays, and that is like they give so much leadership and pressure and like supposed authority to younger Christians. And although like you have a character that is mature, you had a walk that was teenager. You know what I mean? Like you were not like you weren't a baby anymore, but you were not an adult either. Like you were mature, but you shouldn't have like had to carry a weight like that. And then also the fact that you presented yourself as righteous, speaking out about righteousness, um, which I think anyone who's listening to this podcast could respect. Um, for them to turn on you like that is just something that I've been really thinking about more and more during this season of COVID and like churches and things. And that is the brand will always come before a person. They'll always protect their
absolutely,
brand before they'll protect you.
absolutely,
And unfortunately, you were bold, you were wise, you were affluent in the word. You had an encounter, and I wonder how many people actually have encounters with Jesus. Like they really just love the culture of Jesus, but do they have an encounter with him? And when you have an encounter with him, you want to do what's right. You want to be pleasing to him. And it's so sad because you are seeking the best for your friend who's also the pastor, who's also like, the lead pastor now. But like you were in essence like really reaching out like as a friend and as a fellow believer um to repent, to lead by example.
yeah,
And it was interpreted as like I would say like it was interpreted as a power grab, and and and
absolutely,
and
and
that's not
other
what it
ways
was,
too.
because I relate to that because like I think about being a deacon and being shut down at 15, and I think about being older and then being in a church that turned out to be a cult. But before I realized that, like we were going through these changes, and I remember like being really passionate about outreach and about our chemical recovery ministry, which was like our version of AA. And I was like, yeah, but what about these guys? Like, what about these guys that are struggling with substances? What about the homeless? And they're like, oh, well, we don't have a conviction about that. And ultimately, it was like, because I don't have senior leadership or something like that, I had just gotten baptized in their church. That like, I'm seen as someone who's immature or something, and I'm like, nah, man. Like, so I ended up going to another church, and I just see this over and over and over again, or the idea of being faithful to God and watching your friends or your leaders drop like flies, you know?
Absolutely. And the motive, I think, where our hearts are so pure, and then your motives get questioned. And in this particular case, that's exactly what happened with like the higher arc leadership, that they totally questioned my character, my motives, and my integrity, which was truly, purely, it was rooted in love, love to cover this person, love, also in Proverbs, it talks about rebuking, your brother in love, like wounds from a friend can be trusted, but multiple kisses, or in this case, like when you want to like flatter people, flatter their ego or their title or their position, like I didn't care for that. And I, like you said, like I in a sense I was I was a teenager, and it hit me so hard after years ago. I was like, I was a baby Christian, and I was here trying to protect the baby Christian, to protect the flock, because I saw the lead pastor got so distracted, and I could see the attacks that were coming in his weakness. I knew what his
And,
weaknesses were.
and
And that's where I felt like I wanted to cover him and protect him. But essentially, I was myself also a baby Christian. It was projecting, but I was spiritually advanced and mature, which a lot of people had told me, but that was where the disassociation was.
yeah,
And I didn't have the theology. Like I wasn't really rooted in the theology. I knew the terms of the Bible and scriptures, I could quote them, but I didn't know the theological aspect of
yeah. And
it.
like, and you weren't part of this church long enough to be able to have that type of, proximity relationship with senior leadership to
Absolutely.
to be respected of your opinion.
Absolutely.
So they use that against you. And so what would a senior leader who's afraid of losing power do? And that, well, he'd get rid of or slander the one that is less known but is zealous and is liked, but like, make them disappear. And so
Which is interesting because you say something very, very key in that. Absolutely, it was a position of threat of power in dismantling their specific power over authority, because they had the authority over this
mm,
individual. But there was actually a trust that was built because we had so much traction in this campus. We were growing exponentially over, lapping some of the other campuses that had kind of started out very young too, but we were just superseding. I mean, we were the seventh campus. So, you know, up for discussion. Seven is, number of holiness and completion. But yeah, so he did know who I was. He actually even requested for me, saying, "Who is this young lady that is causing such a stir up in a good way?" So it was like
wow.
when it was in his favor, when I was producing the
When it
numbers,
was
when I was
favorable.
promoting the brands, when it was favorable, I had favor with him. But when I became a threat because I came into truth and I was standing up for the truth of who I was serving, which was, the one of truth, the judge supreme himself, then it became an issue. And that's when I realized, to be honest, John Paul, or I don't know if your followers know you as Jane P, I realized I was not, it was more than I could see. It was honestly like a principality. They say this in the Christian. It was deeper.
Yeah.
I was wrestling with
Dark
something that
forces.
wanted to have control and had control and had manipulation tactics and tactics of fear. There was so much fear mongering, and you can see that now with what's happening in our
It's
society. So I
witchcraft.
experienced that completely, completely. And I that's why I had so much empathy and compassion for this pastor, because I saw how tired and how weak and how much he was, he had studied to be a lawyer. So academically he was well equipped. He was very intelligent, very gifted, but it was just breaking him down, and essentially it broke our campus. The scripture says a house divided cannot stand. And we came to that point that we became a house divided. But essentially, I was the one that was turned on, that the enemy used to slander and bring up all the lies. And to this day, there's a lot of people in that campus that don't even know what happened. I had to allow myself to go to this place of such humility. And the Lord told me to not to defend myself. He specifically said, "Don't defend
Hmm.
yourself. I will,
Oh,
I will
avenge you.
fight on your
Wow.
behalf." Absolutely. And you know what? He kept his word. And I didn't even have to be there to see it. He actually called me to another location, a couple zip codes over, a couple cities over, planted another church in my same city, Miami. And I come to find out, JP, 2 years later, that that same executive pastor that the Lord spoke to me that he would avenge me was removed from that position, was removed from that church because he had caused so much division amongst all 9 locations that he was an overseer. The church had split in half. He had caused so much strife and pain. And the Lord told me, I was testing your heart to see if you would be the one of those who would speak up for truth. And unfortunately, truth comes with
A
something.
price.
It also comes with a
Hmm.
cost.
Everything with a
Absolutely.
price.
And everything must come with a price. And hopefully our Storybrooke fans will get that. Once upon a time, that's kind of demonic. That show,
Rumpelstiltskin.
anyways. I love him forever.
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah, like essentially he was showing me like truth will do 2 things. It will set people free or essentially piss people off. And you could see this. And the Lord was very clear, So when you're in bondage and you're under so much fear, and the truth is in front of you, and God brings the truth to us in seasons, and He's so gracious. He's
Come
so
on.
gracious. He's so gracious. Because if we don't learn it the first time, then He's going to come again in another season, and He's going to introduce it again. And the hopes is that we'll get it the second and the third time. And so, when you carry conviction, you become like uh you will stir up a hostility in
Well,
people that you're not even trying to. But when you carry conviction, it causes something to happen in people. It literally causes this pricking to come forth upward of what is actually in secret and in darkness.
Mm.
Because that's why we're called in this body of Christ. Iron sharpens iron, right? And in the kingdom, there's nothing hidden. So, all that to be said, John Paul, it was honestly the hardest years of my life because after that point, I was actually dismissed from that location. They told me that I could no longer serve at that campus. They sent me to another location, the same location I actually got sent out of, and that was such a difficult season because the church that they told me I couldn't go to was going to that church to celebrate their holiday parties. And I was just like, what in the world is this madness? Like, it was
They're
such double
obviously not
standard. I
in
kid you not.
communication.
No, it was deliberate. Again, it was a passive aggressive spirit that was just wanting to overpower,
And
and I
like
had to
and
just
like let's just take a moment real quick. So like just want to say thank you to Anchor because they used to
yes.
shut us down like after like a certain amount of minutes, but they're just letting us go. So I just want to say shout out to them. If you want to start a
We have a
podcast,
hope.
you know, use them. They provide everything for free and all the streaming. All right.
Thank
So
you, Anchor. You are the hope of the anchor for our souls in this day.
yeah.
So,
So
closing this
but
out, John Paul, I wrestled with spirit of suicide, and that's really what really did the final thing for
yeah,
me.
yeah. Well, I wasn't like rushing you. I was just taking a moment to check in with just like how, you know, I don't know, just taking like a moment for people who are listening to like sort of just process that. And like yeah, like you know, if you've been hurt by church, you're not alone. Um I think what's so powerful is that for some people being removed from a church could hurt, but you know they recover or whatever. You know, I was removed from a church. Luckily, I had friends, and I was able to recover. I think. Um, in recent, in like in the last couple of weeks, though, like that's kind of been re-triggered again by someone I look up to, and now it feels like that home is gone, like forever. At least in how I understood it. And so I'm thinking about everyone that like received from that leader and like their hearts and how they're doing and what will happen if people speak out if they saw something or knew something. And I feel like your testimony is just so interesting because it's like they didn't just like ask someone to leave. They like wounded your entire witness. They hurt you. They hurt
Wow.
you as a young woman. Like they stunted your growth as a person because it's like I think of a friend of mine who once said in high school that that this teacher told her that she was stupid. And so she didn't speak again until like years later, like when we were friends. And she was like in her
Wow.
30s, you know? And after she got her master's degree, and okay, cool, yeah. So we'll take a momentary break and come right back, but because Nizzle's got to use the pizzle.
You're not gonna say
But
that.
yeah. So yeah, I appreciate that. We're gonna take a quick break. We're gonna listen to some announcements, and then be right back
Oh
with
my,
Natty Marie. Thanks for listening to Who Dares Wins.
that's
Yeah,
so
yeah, yeah.
funny.
So just check out, and then we'll come back. Okay.
Okay, we'll come back in. You're gonna